The moment Donald Trump launched what many expected would be another devastating personal attack, the atmosphere inside the studio changed instantly. What began as an ordinary daytime television appearance quickly transformed into something far more intense. Under the bright studio lights, the audience settled into their seats expecting a spirited political conversation, perhaps a few disagreements, and the usual exchange of opinions. Nobody realized they were about to witness a confrontation that would dominate discussions long after the cameras stopped rolling. At the center of it all sat two people with very different approaches to conflict. Donald Trump, known for his aggressive style and willingness to attack critics directly, and Whoopi Goldberg, a veteran television personality whose calm demeanor often concealed a sharp and calculated approach. As Trump walked onto the stage, he carried the same confidence audiences had seen countless times before. He greeted the crowd, shook hands with the hosts, and settled comfortably into his chair. The audience responded with applause, while others watched more cautiously. Almost immediately, there was a noticeable tension in the room. It wasn't open hostility, but it was enough that even members of the production team appeared unusually attentive. Something about the interaction felt different. Camera operators stayed focused, producers monitored every exchange closely, and the atmosphere carried the unmistakable feeling that one wrong comment could change everything. The interview began calmly enough. Trump answered questions about leadership, politics, and public life with the confidence that has long defined his public appearances. His responses were concise and polished. Whoopi listened carefully, occasionally nodding as she guided the discussion forward. For several minutes, everything appeared normal. The audience relaxed. The co-host smiled. It looked like another routine television interview. Then Whoopi began asking more pointed questions. She shifted the conversation toward trust, accountability, and public leadership. Her tone remained respectful, but the nature of the questions changed. Instead of discussing broad political topics, she focused on consistency between words and actions. How should public leaders earn trust? How can citizens evaluate honesty? What responsibilities come with making decisions that affect millions of people? Trump responded quickly, insisting that leadership was about strength, honesty, and delivering results. He spoke with certainty, emphasizing that he had always been truthful with the American people. The audience reacted positively at first. Some laughed at his jokes, others applauded. On the surface, the exchange remained friendly, but Whoopi wasn't finished. After allowing Trump to explain his views, she followed up with a question that subtly shifted the tone of the entire interview. If fairness and honesty were so important, she asked, how could leaders ensure their actions consistently match their words? The question wasn't hostile, it wasn't accusatory. Yet something about it clearly irritated Trump. The change was small at first. His smile tightened slightly. His posture shifted. His fingers gripped the armrest a little harder. Most viewers probably wouldn't have noticed, but those inside the studio did. The atmosphere became heavier. Audience members leaned forward. The co-hosts exchanged quick glances. The easy rhythm of the interview suddenly disappeared. Trump attempted to redirect the discussion by arguing that no public figure had been treated more unfairly than he had. Some audience members applauded, but the reaction felt weaker than before. The energy had changed. Everyone could sense it. Whoopi remained calm. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She simply listened. And that seemed to make Trump even more uncomfortable. When she attempted to continue her question, Trump abruptly cut her off. His voice became louder. The measured confidence he had displayed earlier was replaced by visible frustration. He accused her of asking unfair questions and claimed she had been biased against him for years. The audience reacted immediately. Some gasped, others shifted uneasily in their seats. Then came the moment that completely changed the interview. Trump moved from criticizing the question to attacking Whoopi personally. He questioned her relevance. He mocked her career. He dismissed her accomplishments. The comments were sharp, direct, and unmistakably personal. The reaction inside the studio was immediate. Several audience members visibly recoiled. One person stood up in protest. The co-host looked stunned. Even people who had been enjoying the spirited debate moments earlier appeared uncomfortable. Yet the most surprising reaction came from Whoopi herself. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't respond emotionally. She didn't interrupt. Instead, she quietly adjusted her glasses and reached toward a folder she had brought with her. That single movement changed everything. For the first time all afternoon, Trump's confidence appeared to waver. His eyes moved toward the folder, then back to Whoopi, then back to the folder again. The audience noticed it too. The room fell unusually quiet. Suddenly, the insults didn't seem nearly as important as whatever was inside those pages. Whoopi sat calmly while the tension continued building. She looked less like someone who had been rattled by criticism and more like someone patiently waiting for the right moment. The louder Trump became, the calmer she appeared. The contrast was impossible to ignore. As the silence stretched longer and longer, people throughout the studio began sensing that the interview was approaching a turning point. And for the first time since walking onto the stage, Donald Trump no longer looked completely certain about what would happen next. As the tension continued building inside the studio, everyone could feel that the conversation had reached a critical point. Trump had already abandoned the calm, controlled tone he brought to the stage and shifted into personal attacks. The audience had reacted with shock. The co-host looked increasingly uncomfortable, and the atmosphere no longer resembled a normal television interview. Yet the most surprising part was Whoopi's response. She remained completely composed. While Trump raised his voice and attempted to dominate the exchange, she simply sat quietly, listening, watching, and allowing the moment to unfold. That contrast became impossible to ignore. The louder he became, the calmer she appeared. The audience expected an argument. They expected shouting. They expected a dramatic exchange of insults that would quickly spiral out of control. Instead, Whoopi chose a different approach. She reached toward the folder she had brought with her and slowly opened it. The movement itself seemed insignificant, but it instantly changed the mood in the room. People stopped talking. The audience leaned forward. Even Trump appeared distracted by whatever documents she had prepared. For the first time during the interview, the focus shifted away from the insults and towards something else entirely. Whoopi explained that public leadership is ultimately measured by consistency. Leaders make promises. Leaders present themselves in a certain way. But the real test comes when people compare those promises to actions. Her voice never rose above a conversational tone. She wasn't trying to overpower Trump. She wasn't trying to win through volume. Instead, she was asking whether public figures should be held accountable for the standards they set for themselves. The audience listened carefully because the conversation had suddenly moved beyond personalities and into something broader. Trump attempted to redirect the discussion, insisting once again that he had been treated unfairly throughout his career. He argued that critics constantly distorted his record and ignored his accomplishments. Some audience members applauded, while others remained silent. But the energy in the room had changed. People were no longer reacting to individual comments. They were paying attention to the contrast between the two approaches unfolding in front of them. One side relied on confrontation, the other relied on questions. Whoopi then returned to a theme she had introduced earlier: transparency. She noted that public trust depends on openness and accountability. When leaders ask citizens to trust them, she argued, they also accept responsibility for answering difficult questions. The point wasn't directed at a single issue. It was broader than that. It was about whether powerful people should be willing to face scrutiny without immediately treating every challenge as a personal attack. The audience reacted strongly because the observation felt larger than politics. People recognized the idea from workplaces, communities, and everyday life. Trust is difficult to build and easy to lose. It requires consistency. It requires honesty. Most importantly, it requires the willingness to answer questions even when those questions are uncomfortable. The more Whoopi spoke, the clearer it became that she wasn't trying to score points. She was trying to shift the conversation back toward accountability. Trump, however, appeared increasingly frustrated. Every attempt to change the subject seemed to bring the discussion back to the same central issue. Instead of debating personalities, Whoopi kept returning to principles. Instead of exchanging insults, she focused on responsibility. That approach made it difficult for Trump to regain control of the conversation because there was nothing dramatic to attack. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't accusing. She was simply asking whether leaders should be judged by the same standards they ask others to follow. The audience grew quieter with every passing minute. Even the co-host seemed hesitant to interrupt. There was a growing sense that something significant was happening, not because of any shocking revelation, but because of the way the exchange was unfolding. The contrast between confrontation and composure had become the story. One person was trying to win through force, the other was relying on patience. As the discussion continued, Whoopi lifted several documents from the folder and referred to public statements, interviews, and past comments about leadership, honesty, and accountability. She emphasized that her goal wasn't to attack anyone personally. Instead, she wanted to understand how those principles should apply when public figures are confronted with criticism. The audience responded with applause because the point felt reasonable. Regardless of politics, most people agreed that leaders should be willing to explain themselves. For the first time all afternoon, Trump seemed unsure about how to proceed. The personal attacks that had energized him earlier no longer carried the same impact. The room wasn't responding to anger anymore, it was responding to calmness. Every attempt to escalate the conflict only made Whoopi's restraint stand out even more, and that was when the interview truly changed. What had started as a clash of personalities was becoming something else entirely. A conversation about power, accountability, and the difference between reacting emotionally and responding thoughtfully. The audience could sense that the most important moment of the interview was still ahead, and every person in the room was waiting to see what would happen next. As the interview moved into its final stretch, the atmosphere inside the studio had changed completely. The loud exchanges from earlier were gone. The audience was no longer reacting to insults or interruptions. Instead, everyone seemed focused on the contrast that had emerged throughout the conversation. Trump had entered the stage projecting confidence and control, expecting to dominate the discussion through force of personality. Whoopi had taken the opposite approach. She remained calm, measured, and deliberate. The more emotional the exchange became, the more composed she appeared. By now, that contrast had become impossible for anyone in the room to ignore. Whoopi continued returning to the same theme: accountability. Public figures often speak about honesty, transparency, and leadership, but those ideas only matter when they are tested. It is easy to talk about principles when the questions are friendly. It is much harder when the questions become uncomfortable. She explained that real confidence is not demonstrated by how loudly someone responds to criticism. It is demonstrated by the ability to answer difficult questions without losing composure. The audience applauded because the observation felt universal. It applied to politics, business, leadership, and everyday life. Trump attempted several times to redirect the conversation toward familiar topics. He spoke about his accomplishments, the challenges he had faced, and the criticism he believed was unfair. But each time the discussion drifted away, Whoopi calmly brought it back to the same central issue. If leaders ask for trust, should they also be willing to face scrutiny? If they ask others to be accountable, should they be held to the same standard? The questions themselves were simple, but they carried weight because they focused on principles rather than personalities. As the exchange continued, members of the audience became increasingly engaged. Some nodded in agreement, others remained silent, carefully listening. Even people who had entered the studio strongly supporting one side or the other seemed drawn into the larger conversation. The discussion was no longer about political preferences. It was about leadership and responsibility. That shift gave the interview a significance that extended far beyond the stage. One of the co-hosts eventually acknowledged the change in the room. What had started as a routine television segment now felt like something much more serious. The audience wasn't reacting to dramatic revelations or shocking accusations. They were reacting to the contrast between two very different approaches to pressure. One relied on confrontation, the other relied on patience. One sought control through volume, the other relied on discipline. The longer the conversation continued, the more apparent that difference became. Every attempt to escalate tensions only highlighted Whoopi's calmness. Every emotional reaction made her restraint appear even stronger. The audience recognized it immediately. They weren't simply watching a disagreement, they were watching two fundamentally different ideas about strength. One definition viewed strength as dominance, the other viewed strength as composure. Eventually, Whoopi closed the folder and placed it on the table. The gesture seemed small, but it carried a sense of finality. She explained that truth does not become stronger because it is shouted. Facts do not become more convincing because they are repeated loudly. What matters is whether people are willing to confront difficult questions honestly and consistently. The room fell silent because everyone understood the point she was making. For a few moments, there was no interruption, no joke, no applause, just silence. Then Whoopi delivered her final observation. When people cross a line, she said, the answer is not always to shout louder. Sometimes the most powerful response is to remain calm and let the facts speak for themselves. The audience erupted into applause. It was the loudest reaction of the entire interview, not because of a dramatic confrontation, but because many people felt they had witnessed something rare, a public disagreement that revealed more through composure than through conflict. As the applause continued, Trump stood from his chair and prepared to leave the stage. The swagger that had defined his entrance was noticeably absent. He offered a brief response, criticized the discussion, and reiterated his belief that he had been treated unfairly. But the energy had shifted. The audience wasn't focused on the final words. They were focused on everything that had happened leading up to them. The cameras eventually turned back toward Whoopi, and the crowd responded with a standing ovation. Co-hosts praised her composure. Audience members continued applauding. Some were still debating the discussion among themselves. Others simply watched in silence, reflecting on what they had witnessed. What began as a standard interview had evolved into something much larger, a conversation about power, accountability, and the difference between reacting emotionally and responding with discipline. Long after the segment ended, that was the image many viewers remembered most. Not the insults, not the arguments, not even the tension. What stayed with them was the contrast. One person tried to control the room through force, the other controlled it through calmness. And in the end, it was that calmness that left the strongest impression of all.